Thank you for recording this, Slatina. All right, so Robert is initially trained in music, but later went on to become an academic doing applied research in the field of contextual behavioral science through the Australian National University. And over the last decades, he has been working with communities, organizations, and governments across the Australian, Pacific, African, Asian, European, and American regions, so basically across the entire globe. And currently, he's working with ProSocial World. Maybe, Slatina, if you can put a link into the chat. It's ProSocial World is an organization that has developed a change method based on behavioral and evolutionary sciences that enhances cooperation and collaboration for groups of all types and sizes, and that is effective at multiple scales. And he engages with co-designing behavioral and evolutionary approaches to realize environmental and socio-cultural resilience and well-being. So it was a little bit of a load, but Robert, you can also talk a little bit more about yourself and maybe introduce yourself again. I'm hereby giving you the floor to talk about pro-social governance. And yeah.
Thanks, Milena.
Just stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. And maybe one last thing, if people have questions, just put it in the chat and we'll gather them throughout the session.
Yeah, greetings everybody. It's a delight to be here and to see Lillian again. We've worked together before. And I kind of wonder whether some others on the call, we may have crossed paths, but what's some things I can say about me and what I do. I mean, thanks for the glowing introduction, Milena. It actually sounds like I know something, but really, I'm now nearly 70 years old, and I've realised that what have I realised? That I actually don't know a lot at all, except that we have an extraordinary capacity within us to work together, to rise to the challenges of our time. And that something very extraordinary happens when you meet kindred spirits and you turn your attention to the things that actually matter. It's incredibly vital. And I'm feeling very privileged to be sharing this space with you. I mean, I applaud your effort. It's just so important. And I'm sure I don't have to elaborate on why. I think it's pretty clear, unless we're doing the work that we're aiming to do, in a few generations' time, they're not going to be living in a happier world. But I'm very confident that we can sow the seeds through these kind of efforts to realise extraordinary change. And one of the things I want to do today is share some of the stories, just celebrate some of the most extraordinary journeys folk have taken that I've had the privilege of working with. And occasionally I might use 2 or 3 big words, to make out like I actually do know what I'm talking about. Just before we get into it, I'd like to, the opening question was delightful. Think about the last time you experienced great collaboration and what was happening. So I'd love to hear it 1 or 2 voices.
Hello.
Does anybody want
to share?
Oh,
I'll start it off and then maybe some more voices come. So recently in Mallorca, during the first meeting of the kind of core group of a land and sea alliance that are growing and that we're supporting, who are embarking on kind of an exploration of self-organization for holistic land and seascape regeneration in Mallorca and perhaps even beyond to the Balearic Islands. What made it great that they all arrived in a kind of a mindset of deep and active listening, of kindness, and patience, and also a shared understanding of what it's going to take to try and fail together over an initial period of prototype and governance. So a willingness to practice together and the trust in each other to do that. So the kindred spirits point you made kind of resonates with that a bit.
Yeah, I think that's the glue you know, and active listening is just so critical. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thanks, Ellie. Someone else. Lillian, I know you've got a story.
I do, but I was allowing the space for more people. I will just say very briefly, definitely coming in with the same willingness, but it has also to do with being vulnerable, leaving any ego out of the door or outside the door, and coming in with a curiosity, a willingness to explore what it takes, and then knowing for a given, I'm taking given, there will be issues, right? But the attitude is, how do we sit with and work through those together? And I think that's key. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, I can only, thanks, Lillian, and I can only imagine that if everybody respond to that question, we'd probably hear similar answers. Am I right? And here's where I actually need some kind of feedback from folks, maybe a thumbs up or a, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's, so let me share some of my experiences that actually reflect this, the exact sentiment that's been expressed, you know, in the intro that that Milena gave me, but also in the words of Lillian and Ellie. I'm going to share some slides. So I spent this afternoon contemplating the work you're doing and put these together. And one of the things that I caught in you know, in the materials that was shared with me before I came was this framework. And there's so many things that resonate for me in here. You know, the whole idea of thinking in terms of generations and acting now in the service of that future. And these processes, I mean, they align very much with the kind of processes we're employing in ProSocial world, which shows me that what works for one works for all. And the other thing is these impacts, you know, these contexts in which you might work, but also the nature of impact. I mean, this framework aligns so much with what we're doing, and I have no doubt that you could probably teach. Well, you could teach me and those that I'm working with things as well. But just to share a little bit of what I've learned. So, I mean, the focus of this one is on collaboration, isn't it? Yeah. And so let's zoom in on that. So when I thought about today's session, the aim for me was to explore the idea of pro-social governance, which is about creating trust and collaboration. And this is based on some extraordinary work by a woman named Eleanor Ostrom. And I'm going to introduce her to you in a minute. She was the one who recognized these design principles. And so we're going to actually unpack those and begin considering how they might apply in your context. And I'm going to share a number of experiences that I've had, you know, where I've observed different communities and organizations and governments actually respond to the kind of processes you're going through actually. Just so you kind of got a window into our world, this is kind of the sequel to the slide that I shared before. So whenever I and other folk in ProSocial world are working with anyone, these are the core processes that we go through. And we use very varying methods to actually do it. But first of all, we identify context for change and then do the self-development work. That's the inner work that you spoke about, Ellie and Vivian. And this is where it's becoming very sensitive to the needs that we have as individuals and as groups, and listening and sensing very deeply, not only to others, but the environment and all life, in fact, and freeing ourselves up to be able to respond in a direction that's going to enhance vitality. We spend time developing vision of a future, which is exactly what you're doing. But we then dive into the topic that we're going to get into today about governance. I mean, how do we weave our cultural fabric and the climate of institutions so that it enhances our capacity to be truly authentic and present, and more than vulnerable, I think open. Vulnerable implies there's threat. Where there's real trust and collaboration, you can be fully open without any threat of being made wrong. And then it's the work of qualifying opportunities and embarking on a program of participatory action learning. And I kind of sensed, Lillian, you touched on this, the willingness to explore. One of the key things that I've learned is, and I think we all know this, relapse is utterly natural. There's not one of us here, I bet, who's been able to come up with a New Year's resolution and just do it straight off the bat. We can't. And so this is a behavioural principle. I mean, this is central to the science that I'm interested in. So I'm a contextual behavioural scientist, and I'm interested in particularly how language functions to predict well-being. But the other thing is that the science that is informed my thinking acknowledges that really there's no such thing as failure when we're in our natural condition. There is just relapse and maybe struggles. But if you approach them with psychological flexibility, which is the capacity that the inner work we do, then when you relapse, you'll go around this cycle at least 3 to 5 times. It's just a fact. Every single person on this call, if you want the beginnings of change to emerge, you've got to be prepared to relapse at least 3 to 5 times. And so what do? When you relapse, you just get together with your friends and you kind of reboot and you try something new. And so this is a really, really important part of the process that we go through. We qualify opportunities and then we try stuff. And if we relapse, we just dust ourselves off and we regroup around what the vision is, and we just have another go until new and sustainable behaviours emerge. And we try and wrap this up in research if we can. Anyway, let's get into it. So this is Elinor Ostrom. She got a Nobel Prize in 2009 in economics. She was the first woman to ever get the Nobel Prize in economics. And sadly, she passed away in 2012. And one of the co-founders of ProSocial World, David Sloan Wilson, worked with her. And so that's why her science of the commons, we call it, how to manage the commons based on these principles, is folded into what we do. So David's an evolutionary scientist. Paul Atkins and I, who are the other folk in the team, are behavioural scientists. And there's another chap, Jeff Ganung. He's very interested in the intersection between science and spirituality. So these are the threads of our work. But anyway, Ostrom, she and her husband, Vincent, they met when they were in their 20s, and they became very interested in what is going on when people successfully collaborate, not only to look after each other, but their environment. And it ended up in a 40-year research agenda. And many people, she set herself up at a university. It's not Binghamton, I can't remember the university now, but there's Ostrom's workshop. So a large faculty spent 40 years, and they're continuing to do it now, doing research and trying to figure out what is the answer to this question. But Elinor became interested in this one. How are common pool resources managed successfully? And to do this, she went into communities all over the world and looked at what she was doing. And I watched a documentary of hers, and this is after she got the prize. And she said, for 40 years, I was looking for the rules in the governance system. But she said she realized after 40 years that there's no rules. There are just these 8 principles that people employ in really unique ways. And when I introduced them in a minute, they're just common sense. So she observed Indigenous communities doing this. They were doing these, they were sort of crafting their culture based on these principles for hundreds of years. The most successful sort of contemporary institutions, which is a space that her husband, Vincent, got into, like local governments and things like that. They did it in their own way. And so in a minute, I'm going to give you some examples that kind of really illustrate this. But she did two things. I'm sure you all agree with this. I mean, she observed that economic theory assumes that we're all self-interested and that it is irrational to act altruistically. Current economic theory also suggests that this trait invariably results in a tragedy of the commons, that people just act selfishly and exploit the environment to their own ends. And in order to control people, these two forms of systems need to be put in place: centralized markets or top-down centralized government. Anyway, she debunked that, and she noticed that people, she showed this in the lab, but she also showed it in the field, that people actually managed to cooperate in very, very successfully in very complex networks and groups. And in supportive contexts, humans quite naturally act altruistically. And I think we all know that. So how do we construct these supportive contexts is what she has taught us. She noticed that in experiments that if people can't communicate, they've got no choice but to act selfishly because they have no idea what the interest of another person is. But as soon as people could communicate, they naturally tried to work together to look after each other. This is her in the Commons. And so these are the principles that she identified. And you've got them on the slides. I mean, you'll have a copy of these slides and there's a handout and everything that you'll have as well. But they're very intuitive. People knew what they had a shared sense of identity and purpose. They knew what they were responsible for, and they worked together to preserve the life that they were custodians of. Once they derived shared purpose and who owned it, then they figured out what was equitable. There's always an equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. There's always fair and inclusive decision-making. So that means that the central organizing principle was the needs of everybody who was implicated by a decision. So no decision was made without understanding the needs of everyone who was impacted by that. And once the groups figured out what they were doing, they monitored what they were doing. They just tracked their behavior, which is kind of the action learning bit. And there was these feedback loops, both material and relational, that allowed them to monitor the effects of their actions and their choices. And they just kept, it's like jumping on a spaceship to go to the moon. You just keep puffing the rockets to keep you on track. And when things weren't working well, there was evolutionary responses to helpful and unhelpful behaviors. This was a biggie because most systems are very punitive. People just get hung out to dry, or they're just made wrong if there was mistakes. But in the communities that successfully collaborated for centuries, for generations, there was these restorative practices where they restored like conflict resolution. It was restoring dignity and well-being. It was baked in. But then this is the thing, these last two is what got her the prize. She noticed that at the systemic level, like there's this map over here, where you've got individual people who will look after their plot, but then you might have a village and then you have neighboring villages and the system just gets bigger. She noticed that at the local level, between people who shared responsibility for a region, they all implemented the first 6 principles. And when local people, like if this was your plot, you were given the authority to self-govern. Then in relation to neighboring villages, the same 6 principles were figured out. They figured out what their purpose was at this level in the system and what equity looked like between villages and how they could make decisions together as villages so that the needs of one village were looked after by the other. And they tracked their relationship to each other. And when they went off track, they figured out how to get back on track. But each village was given the autonomy to self-regulate. Autonomy to self-govern was a huge insight. People hate being told what to do. This is one of the biggest flaws of the regulatory systems that are in place around the world. And with autonomy, people can figure out how to do these 6 things in their own utterly unique ways. And they just figure out how to collaborate between groups by doing these things to preserve the autonomy and the integrity of the local groups. And so they're kind of no-brainers, really. But what I've noticed and what she noticed is that these are the basics. I mean, some communities have additional principles that they add to these, but these are the core. And if any one of these are lacking, then the system doesn't work. It starts to collapse. And I think that's the beauty of it. It becomes the pulse of the system. David Sloan Wilson observed that these principles follow from evolutionary dynamics on cooperation. And he's done a whole lot of work that has shown that our capacity to do this for centuries has led to the evolution of society as we know it in many ways. So some examples. Okay, I'll give you this one. I'm going to share about 2. In the slide pack, I've got about 6. And I'm going to show you a 2-minute video of this guy here, Godfrey Wabizi, his name is. I'm going to give you really contrasting examples. So he amazing guy, Godfrey. I worked with him, must have been about 2012, I guess. He came to the Australian National University to do a course that I was hosting for people across Africa who are trying to figure out how to respond to different forms of tragedies of the commons, particularly it was in the space of ocean governance and sustainable fisheries. Anyway, Godfrey, when he arrived, he headed up he worked for the government in Nigeria. And he and his team were responsible for trying to curb illegal fishing practices around 2 freshwater lakes. And there were 9 tribes that lived around these lakes. And the lakes were almost devoid of fish. They'd been completely overfished. And they resorted to making homemade dynamite to blow up the last bits of fish that were in there. And this plate is indicative of a catch. And customary rule had it that the son of a fisherman had to be a fisherman. They weren't allowed to diversify the way in which they got food. And it got so bad that Godfrey told me stories about, for some of these tribes, I mean, they relied enormously on external aid, but in order to fend for themselves, they tried to sell whatever fish they could in local marketplaces. And the whole culture becomes so deteriorated that some of the girls had to give away their body to the fishmongers if they were to take fish. It was just abhorrent behaviour. And you can see his white Land Rover in the background. So for everyone I've worked with, I take them through the processes that I introduced before, and then there's always field work, usually 6 to 8 months worth of participatory action learning. And so he went back and he was sending me videos every month and these reports, and his success criteria initially was how many people he could arrest for making homemade dynamite, or how many mosquito nets they could confiscate, which is what they used to drag the last bits of fish out of the lake. He went back and he asked the kind of questions that you've asked naturally in this course. What kind of future do you want for your future generations? And what are the critical factors that need to be impacted if you're to realize those factors? And what are the opportunities we've got? And once they named opportunities, they then had a conversation about these design principles. And the opportunities represented principle number 1, shared purpose. So within the context of that shared purpose, whether it was to try and clean up local markets, to look after women, or to look after the descendants of these children, the children of these tribes, or to collaborate as 9 tribes around the lake, those opportunities were then, they looked at them and said, okay, how do we apply Eleanor's principles in these situations? So in the markets, we brought in other NGOs, and they trained people to set up markets that were actually much more ethically regulated. With the children, they questioned cultural norms. Godfrey emailed me one day and he said in his Afrikaans language, long-term change is for sure now, my friend. He said fundamental beliefs have been dislodged. And And I asked him what the beliefs were, and he said, well, these tribes, not only did they adhere to their customary rule, sons of fishermen had to be fishermen, they realized they actually should be able to, the kids should be able to grow food in market gardens. So one opportunity was to grow market gardens. And we brought in others to help them do that. The other assumptions they were making was that God decided there was going to be no fish in the lake. And the only way they were going to survive until God decided to put fish back in the lake was to rely on external aid. As a result of the conversation Godfrey orchestrated with them, they were empowered. They realized they had agency, you know, and as Vivian said, there was a willingness to explore, but also, as Ellie pointed out, there was, he changed the listening. He went in there and actively listened to what it is they need and made their needs the organizing principle. And I'll play a video now that, I'll just jump out of that. And so I'm going to play this very short video now. Godfrey, where are you? So this video, he sent this to me at around about month 3. So this is after they developed a sense of vision and purpose and identified opportunities. And they were agreeing then to act, they agreed on shared purpose, which was the beginning of the conversation about these principles. Now you'll see them, when he sent videos at the beginning, when he and his people drove into these villages, the women and children just ran. They were afraid of these people. And the men just retreated and leaned against trees and leant against, you know, their humpies and things like that. You have a look at the difference. They're on ceremonial mats. They're sharing food. You'll see Godfrey, he's in the lower position, very humble guy. And, you know, Oxford PhD. And sitting next to the chief was an interpreter, as well as the local spiritual leader. And at the end of it, you'll hear, it's mostly spoken in Afrikaans, but every now and Godfrey will speak in English. And you'll hear him talk about collaboration and coming together. And at the end, this chief agreed to meet with all the other chiefs of the tribe in a local city in order to talk about these principles between all the 9 tribes. So here we go. I'll share this.
Yes, their intervention. Tell them their intervention. But that if the intervention, like as I say, cannot that. That's why we need their cooperation and they need our own. And we have to be working together. That once we avail ourselves any opportunity, it will also come to them. Amma duk lokacin da dama ya samu shi ya tabbatar muku da yanda ya yi da shi zai kare a bashi a so ya jama'a ya tayu inshallah Tanko, tell him that we are planning to come to Tunga Murwa maybe next month or so.
Wata mai zuwa za mu shigo Tunga Murwa. To madalla yayi magana.
Yo wasa ya hajiya.
Lahajiya lahiya.
To Mary fa. Mary ya zo ko?
Yana zo ba tukwa.
Ba da Yoruba. Bai zo ba? To sanu. Yawa. To kaga da jama'a.
To madalla.
Yawa. Ya.
Very inspiring. I received reports from Godfrey the year after we worked together. And he had data that showed that there was between kind of a 70 and 80% voluntary uptake of healthier practices between all of the tribes around these two lakes. And they were growing market gardens between the villages were alive and well. The markets were cleaned up. It was just extraordinary. I'm going to give you a couple of other examples, and then we're going to invite you into some breakouts and have some conversations about what these principles actually might mean for you. These are others that are on the same course. This is where I traveled over to Africa and spent time with them. It was amazing. Okay, this is a good example. This guy here, Athula, he's from Sri Lanka. This was this program was focused on clean energy, and he was part of an energy utility in Sri Lanka, and kind of a manager, and they were striving to produce clean energy and distribute it to their people. He came to the ANU, went through the core processes I introduced before, and he couldn't think of an opportunity that would impact the critical factors that were impacting his system, and sow a seed for something that would evolve. And the interesting thing about Athula, when I spoke to him, was while he represented the interests of an energy company, I asked him one day, you know, what are you going to do when, what are you interested in? And he was 56 when I worked with him. This is, again, must be about 8 years ago. He said, I'm 56, and when I retire, I'm going to become a monk. So he's very Buddhist and very community oriented. His real passion was about reweaving their cultural fabric. And that's what he wanted to impact on. And so he came up to me the 2 days before he left Australia to go back home. And he said, I've got the idea. I'm going to go back and host a cooking class. I think he must have been watching a course like Celebrity Chef or something. You know, he said, I'm going to go back to Sri Lanka and host a cooking class for our consumers of power. And he said, I'll offer them to do the cooking class, and a part of it will be to learn about how to preserve energy when you're cooking. And if they say they can give a power bill before it, and then when they finish the course, they'll give another power bill. And if they've saved the money, they'll give them that much back as a bonus. But the course itself was about the whole value chain. So he is interested in what does it take for us to look after our environment, grow healthy food, you know, organic food. Also, what does it mean to build community when you're breaking bread, you know, and what does it mean to recycle and not pollute at the other end of the process? He went back, he pitched this idea to the board. At about 2 months after he went back, the board said yes. And he had a close friend who was the journalist. She headed up a local newspaper. And up until that point, he was, you know, all of these people I was working with, they was, you know, I was calling them and they were sending me messages every month. He was saying, oh, we might get 500 people to do the course. Anyway, when his friend, this woman, journalist, published it, there was this flood of response, and they had to cut off enrollments at 2,000. And this is the room of 2,000 people who did the cooking class. And if I had another photo and turned it around, there was a celebrity chef on the stage teaching them how to look after this entire value chain. And anyway, in that audience were people who belonged to the Scouting Association. And they were so impressed by this that they came to Athula and they said, we need to actually do this, introduce this to our children. And so central to this was purpose, look after the entire value chain, and collaborate as a community. So the 8 design principles that I introduced before were baked into this. And so he and his team then met with people in the Scouting Association and figured out how they could collaborate in order to teach the kids how to do it. This is the first event. This is a football stadium. Look how many kids are there. And this is the program on the fence. And this was so successful. Amongst these people was people in the school system who then came to the folk in the Scouting Association and the Thula's team, said, we need to actually be teaching this to all our school kids. So the following year, he kept in touch with me for 3 years. The following year, he contacted me and he said, this was our local government decided to teach this in all our local schools to primary school children. And the following year, all the neighbouring governments heard about it and said, we want to do that too. So he worked together with some analysts to try and figure out how much energy was saved along that value chain across the whole country. It took him a few months to do the analysis, but they worked out that year they would have saved around about $4.8 million in energy. Just amazing outcome, all from one cooking class, and him doing the inner work, crafting a vision, and then forging a culture that was inclined to try new things. I'll give you one more example to show you how, there's so many here. Okay, so I'll use this one quickly. So in 2019, I was asked to work with all the governments in the Pacific Ocean to help them respond to climate challenges. And all the governments in the Pacific had signed what's called the Boy Declaration. They agreed in 2017 that they were going to collaborate in order to impact 4 classes of climate-related issues. One was all the human-related issues to do with health and food security and those kind of things. Others were directly environmentally related. The third class was infrastructure, and the last one was traditional security. I flew to Fiji and I worked with governments for several years. They identified all these factors that they had to impact on in a collaborative manner. Regional politics and governments, climate change, social and cultural norms, economies and livelihoods, infrastructure and services, the nature of conflict, technology change, as well as a big factor is changing demographics and bench strength. So they had to figure out, collaborate, these are these factors here, collaborate by implementing the design, doing the inner work and implementing design principles to change all of these things in their own unique ways. And this is what it looked like. A chart that I'm going to share with you in a minute was shared with them. And at each of these tables, so you can see this is biosecurity. This is a group of people who are interested in biosecurity. I can't see what that one is. I know this group, these two here were the health group. And there was education there, and in some of these, there were communities of chiefs and other NGOs. One of the workshops we did was opened by the Prime Minister. Anyway, they made their way to opportunities that they then acted on. So in schools, we can do this. The Itoke Affairs, which is Indigenous Affairs, they said, with our village chiefs, we can do this. And you know, in the healthcare sector, we could do that. And it led to a whole bunch of things. We worked with the local university to design a program dedicated purely for healthcare workers after COVID hit. And so lots of carouseling. And in it, they were questions about these design principles. So let me set you up for a conversation. We did it with the Ho Chi Minh Academy of Political Leadership. And this is what it looked like when they had this dialogue. I did it with the Museum of Australian Democracy and Finance in Australia. And this is what it looked like when they did it. And the long-term change is off the chart. I mean, if I've got time later, I'll show you some data that we got from the Australian government that showed sustained change 4 years after they did this work. Anyway, the question is, how do we kickstart this conversation about mutual trust and collaboration? And so what I do is I give them this handout, which is what you're going to be given in a minute, to start the conversation. And people are put in groups, intact groups, and they said, okay, so as a group, like you look at the red line within group ranking. So if I maybe zoom in a little bit here, or maybe I can go to another chart. So you'll get a blank one. You'll get this in a minute, but I'll zoom in here. So can you see that? The red is within group ranking. and the black is between group ranking. So I'll zoom in a bit here. So each group has said, okay, so if you're some teachers in a school, and our higher order purpose is like common land. Our higher order purpose is to work together to look after our common land. And the school teachers might say, well, with our school kids, we could do this. And so they'll have a particularized sense of purpose. So those school teachers would say, okay, within our group as school teachers and our school kids, have we got a shared sense of identity? And between us as teachers and the kids, is there equity? And are we making decisions that are inclusive of everyone's needs? And are we monitoring our behaviors as we're tracking? And when things go off track, are we using restorative and action learning approaches to getting back on track? And do we have the authority to self-govern? Are the folk outside of us telling us what to do? And are we doing implementing these principles with the other groups we have to work with? And so I invite them to do this kind of arbitrary ranking. If you had to pick between 0 and 10, it's like 0's in the middle, and that like we hope there's no sense of shared purpose and identity. And 10 is, yep, there's really strong sense of shared group identity. And you do this kind of ranking. And so, for example, here in this example, shared identity is 8 within the group. So you put a mark there. And equity, there's 9 within the group and 8 within the group there. And then you just becomes this spiderweb diagram. And then you ask, okay, the black line is between group rankings. And you say, okay, so we're school teachers, and we've got the school regulators, and we've got parents, and we've got the education department, and we've got this group of people called Commonland who are really working with us to try and help us work with kids. So between all of us, as people who are custodians of this space, how are we tracking as a system? And you ask the same thing. So in this example, the between group ranking is 8 and etc. Generally, this is the pattern. Most times I notice it's kidney shaped. Most people have a reasonable sense of identity. There's forms of equity, often that's lower, and decision making. So they're usually reasonable, at the higher end, but often responding to helpful behaviors and monitoring agreed behaviors, and particularly restorative approaches to conflict resolution is often low because people are punished by the current system. And so that's what we'd like you to do in a breakout. So if you can go into breakout and take this chart, and I think, how much time have we got to do this?
We still have around 20, 25 minutes to do this.
All right.
So yeah, I would suggest we break people. We're about 32 people. We will create groups of 4 to 5.
Yeah.
And you can,
So to give us a time to debrief, maybe if we go in for about 15 to 20 minutes, and this is very fast, but the aim of today's session is just to open the door on the conversation, because I'm really happy to work with you guys afterwards about how you can do this more robustly. But just now, I want you to do enough of a conversation to open up catalyze the thinking, and just pick a group, and as quickly as you can, do a ranking. Kind of just agree, oh yeah, okay, for this group, I reckon it's about this, and agree it and mark it up. And then we'll come back to a plenary, and I'll ask a few people to say, well, what insights did you take as a result of this? And then I'll share with you what could be next steps. How does that sound?
Welcome back, everyone.
Hello.
So, Robert, I think I might just let you lead this, but now is the time to come back and discuss some reflections, some of the things maybe popped out that you discussed in your rooms. So if anyone has already some thoughts or something that they want to share, please do.
Well, I have a question. I draw it, and I am in a school that we built. So after 40 years ago, they started with 5 little children, and one of these children is now a father. And then about 10 years ago, we started to make the secondary school for our children. Okay. So it slowly grows, really slowly. And then to work together as it is an association, you know, there's this purpose of to have an education without propaganda of Hello Kitty, you know, like for example. And so the identity is like really strong together, no? Yep. Purpose. Yep. And the distribution of benefits, I suppose this is how you look at the, yeah, we don't share the depths of the school, but we don't own it. So somehow the teachers have a lot of privileges, but they also earn a very little bit. So I thought, yeah, I don't know, this I found it difficult. Then the decision making, it is always very complicated because all the members are part of the decision making. So this is always long processes. We are all heard and included, and monetary upon behaviors. I don't really get that one, but
okay. So let me just unpack that a bit with, so it's school situation, and what's the purpose? To educate your children.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So in terms of how you go about educating your children, how are you monitoring how well it's going? So you need to monitor the children to see how they're going. You need to monitor the parents to see how they're going. You need to look after the teachers to see how they're going. So monitoring is actually just looking at the health of the system.
Yeah.
For those who are working in the environment, it's monitoring how many fish are in the lake.
Yeah.
You know? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, sorry. Yeah.
You got it? Do you have other questions?
Yeah, there's one question more. It's the authority to self-govern.
Yep. Okay. So do the teachers have the freedom to look after the kids in their own classroom in their own way without being interfered by others outside of the classroom?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do the community of teachers have the authority to work together, to work out curriculum and things like that without interference by others? So that's what it means.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So I'd love to hear from another group. What insights or questions do you have?
Don't be shy.
Yeah, please. So I was speaking with who was I with?
Vicky. You were with me, yeah.
There you are, Victoria. Vicky, do you want to speak about yours? I'll quickly share your map.
Well, I think I have to warn everyone that this was about the entire restoration sector community. So we're not looking at one group, we're looking at the entire, what is happening within the sector. So it's very difficult to score, but it's not in a good place based on issues of land tenure, which already affect autonomy, shared identity and purpose, maybe in some places, but not in others. So I think overall equitable distribution is terrible. Inclusiveness is not. So all of these issues appear in the standards of practice. We say that they need to be, that they're very important for successful restoration, long-term outcomes and so on. but they're not implemented. And I think this is based also on this idea that restoration is an ecological activity, and we forget it's a human affair most of all. So that's why it's scored very low. Yeah, but bear in mind that this is looking at the entire sector as opposed to one community.
Yeah, so this is very high order evaluation. So global policy involving governments, NGOs, the landscape team, different policy actors, landowners, scientists, the UN, etc. This is just some of them. So it's not surprising. I mean, I'm in all the countries where I'm working at the moment, which is just about everywhere. This is, at the broader system level, this is generally the state of affairs. But the question, Vicky, is what's the opportunity? So this is, when I'm doing this, like for example, this is akin to some of the rankings that were in Fiji when I was climate-related issues, and so it's how can we approach this in a participatory, action-learning way? And you mentioned pockets of good practice. So the way in which I approach this, and maybe I can just, I'll share another slide to give you an idea of how to think about this. So if I go back to my slides, I'd love to come back to this slide before we leave. That's really important. When I'm working with folk, and you've got to have an intact team, people who can work together autonomously at the level that they are in the system. And I ask them to qualify an action learning opportunity along these two categories. Is the opportunity fit for vision, and is it fit with capability? So let me unpack this. I learned this from systems engineers at the Australian National University who did long-term innovation road mapping. And I've never forgotten these distinctions. And so they would ask in relation to an opportunity, will it result in the impact you want? And so if I kind of race back to the first slide, you've got to think in relation to your particular project, and these might not be the impact areas that you want, but you need to come up with a class of things. These are the critical factors. If I do this, will it impact on that? The health of our environment, or the well-being of our children, or the distribution of funds or something. You need to name these critical and uncertain factors that you want to impact on. And sorry if I'm making you seasick. And then name them so that as you're experimenting, you can say, yep, it's improving. That's improving. And then you say, okay, we might have a wonderful opportunity that might impact every outcome we want, but there's absolutely no capability in the system to do it. And so this is where these design principles become really important. So the capability is the inner work. Are people acting with integrity and openness and able to listen and actually choose to act in the direction of their own and others' well-being? Without that, that's the glue. And I think you all know that. And so that's one aspect of capability. The other aspect is the outer world. So there's the inner and outer work. The outer world is, are we capable of implementing these design principles? And so is there enough equity within the group for us to be able to do it? Do we have the decision-making processes within the group so far to be able to do it? And you start doing experiments and absolutely expect a relapse, as I was saying before. You'll relapse 3 to 5 times, but eventually you will hit on something that works, like a cooking class. And when you hit on something that solves everybody else's problems because you've thought of these factors, they will say, what are you doing? This is the incredibly important role of overarching authorities. They need to afford autonomy to local groups to experiment. They need to try and resource them to be able to do it. And whenever there's a success, they need to profile it. They need to hoist it up the flagpole in every way it can, through reports and research publications, videos, social media, everything that will just broadcast the message. And then you'll find other opportunities and you just repeat the process. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yes, Robert in the chat. Sorry, guys, I lost my voice. Ellie has asked a
Please.
question to, like, it's interesting to start seeing where the relationships are between the principles. So the relationships between the principles, and also you want to build on that in terms of how the 8 principles also maybe map out onto the 6 steps that you introduced as the ProSocial
Yeah, okay.
in the beginning. And you
So
just touched on that a little bit, but can you elaborate?
Okay. I'll elaborate on that really quickly for sure. So close your eyes because we're going to rip up this thing. Okay. So when these are the processes that we've found work very reliably, actually. And the first one is build a context for change. So it's bring, for example, we could come together and say, we're going to work together and we want to work together long term. So we're actually doing a major project with the Charter for Compassion in America and opening up in Australia now. And they're working with a range of collaboratives in San Antonio and other ones, you know. And so we brought together about 3 months ago, representatives from each 5 different collaboratives, some of them very large. They've got boards and real estate, and they've been intact for 30 years, others very new. Some are virtual, some are actual, focused on homelessness, health, the environment, a bunch of things. So we brought them together and say, do we want to work together to try and figure out how to scale up best practice in your space in terms of compassion? And they would say, yep, absolutely. We're into it. So it just sows the seeds for, okay, what's our aim? Who's responsible for it? What are our relationships? Can we resource, you know, start, you know, is there enough in it to embark on at least this inquiry, and particularly dialogue skills, as you pointed out earlier. And then we pretty much go straight into the inner work, because most people are self-centering and editing. They're trying to control and avoid unwanted experience, either internal or external. And many people, it's amazing how people have forgotten how to love, basically. I think that's the big challenge of this century. We've got to learn to fall in love with each other on the planet. And I don't know how many people I work with, because I'm a behavioral psychologist. This is my gig. And most people beat up on themselves terribly. Oh, I'm not a very good person. Actually, every person is utterly beautiful. We are already amazing. And our behaviors, just because some of the things we do don't work, some of the things may even be abhorrent. And this is a big lesson, you know, that nonviolent communication folk can teach us. And so the inner work is about reinforcing the capacity for individuals to act with self-determination, so that every choice that they make is freely chosen for themselves. And it's in the service of their own well-being, as the well-being of the collective and the environment they're a part of. And so this is reinforcing the intrinsic value of each person. So this is very powerful and deep work. And I know you're working with the Presidency Institute principles and Theory U and that stuff. And I've worked with that institute myself, unpacking some of these ideas. So that's about, as they would say, open your mind, your heart, and your will. So it's a parallel to that. Then the next thing is, okay, what's our vision and purpose? And this is where you say, okay, our purpose is to impact climate and environmental issues over the next 10 to 30 years. And each one of these is stakeholders in the system at different levels. And so how can we forge purpose so that all of us are acting in a direction, whether it's at the level of a classroom or a village or multi-stakeholder international systems? And once this sense of vision and purpose is done, and this is where a lot of foresighting, big systems, I've spent months doing foresighting work and that kind of stuff. But within a group is just forging purpose. And then once you've got a sense of purpose, that's when you say, okay, how are we going to get on with each other as we try new things? And this is where these 8 principles apply. So now we've got principle 1 sorted. What does equity look like? What does decision-making look like? Et cetera, et cetera. And once you put those together, these are the things we want to impact on, and these are the processes. How can we qualify an opportunity so it's fit? And then just do little experiments and just research. This participatory research is just baked in. And there should be another square after this called celebration. So at the end of it, all successes are then positioned within the system so that other people, so it changes it just informs the system. And so that's the, and I just want to go to one more slide before we leave, which is kind of a really core part of this. And in the work, here it is. We pay attention to what is intrinsically important for all involved. And so here we draw a distinction between fundamental needs that sustain life and the unique ways in which we value getting those needs met from any decision and strategy that we employ. And what I've observed over and over is all conflict in the system happens at the level of strategy, and which means that there is a deficit in listening, which is exactly what Ella and Lillian pointed to at the beginning. We need to listen to the needs of others and the environment and make them central to all decision making. And we also need to make available to us the unique ways in which we can add value. Some people love making music and art. Other people love doing research. Other people love teaching. Other people love gardening. Other people love policy. So we need to make it possible for individuals or groups to add their value to the collaborative in order to meet shared needs. And these have to be central to decision-making. Unless these are central to decision-making, purpose is lacking. And then the strategies are a combination of implementing the principles, continuing to do the inner work, action learning to see if you realize the impact. And when the strategy doesn't work, you just treat each other really gently, compassionately, and lovingly. Just go back to the drawing board and say, well, we tried, let's try again. And what I've noticed is that these are the categories of need. Every individual has these 4 classes of need. We need physical well-being. Every person needs to have a sense of freedom, but they also need relationship. These two tear each other apart. Most people feel like the relationships they're in, they're being dominated or coerced. And so we need to create the conditions for people to their value to be reinforced within the context of the relationships, and they have to have agency. As groups, we need environmental well-being. Groups need sovereignty. They need partnership, and they need shared purpose. Exactly the same 4 classes of needs at the group level. So all this work, shaping shared purpose and pulling people together, it's listening for this. And then when shared purpose is clear, then you can start asking the questions about the other design principles.
Thank you, Robert. That was a really, really inspiring and interesting session. We're 4 minutes over time, so we don't really have enough time to do questions and answers. But to wrap it up, I just want to say thank you very much. Everyone who was here will have access to the resources that we used, and you can also use it in your own context, and we'll share Robert's presentation. And
Milena, can I say, if anyone wants to hang around for another 15 minutes and go into a kind of an after program coffee break or something, I'm very happy to hang around and have a conversation with anyone.
Perfect. Thank you for offering this. And I just want to say for everyone else, maybe you can just leave one word in the chat that summarizes this session for you.